Good morning and welcome to America's Web Radio. We're glad to have you listening in. And this is David's Pick on Thursday mornings. And we've got a special guest, our friend Fred Boyles. And he's got an interesting topic we're going to go into. But before we get to talking to Fred, we're going to do our normal thing, which is take one moment of silence and think of all of our friends that have given the ultimate sacrifice and pray for those that are on duty now and will be retiring. So we'll be back right after this, and then we'll play one of our my favorites, the cadence calls. We'll be back, and if you don't mind, we'll take our silent moment of prayer. And I hope you'll join us. And remember that on our website, we also have a memorial to my good friend, J. Roy Ritchie, that died recently from effects of Agent Orange. And we started a veteran to veteran pray list. And if you're a veteran or if you have a friend or relative that's a veteran and needs prayer, just send us their names and we'll be glad to air them and pray for them. And we do thank you. And Fred, thank you for joining us again. And we're going to do that little cadence call. We all appreciate cadence calls, or at least I think we do.
Take them up. Put them down. Put them down. Stay in step. Stay in step. Sounding good. Sounding good. Listen up. Listen up. Got to learn. Got to learn. New cadence. New cadence. Here we go. You can do it. You can do it. Listen.
Okay, that's enough of that. And I can remember that one in the rain, as a matter of fact. And we certainly in Atlanta today have had our fair share of good morning rain, spring rain. And I guess everything else will be blooming. But it is sort of nice to get the pollen washed off a little bit. So, good morning, Fred.
Hey, good morning.
How you doing today?
I'm doing well, and I appreciate you having me on.
Well, we appreciate you being on, and we're taking a little bit of a venture. I guess we could call it southward a little bit, maybe, or whatever you want to title it. But we do know about our veterans, and that, you know, the Hanoi Hilton we know about from Vietnam, and our many different men, and I believe one woman at this point that was in Desert Shield or Desert Storm, and but POWs. And Fred, because I don't know what I'm talking about, I'm sort of going to turn it over to you, and I'll butt in every now and then and ask one of my infamous questions. Sometimes they're okay, and sometimes they show my the real me, stupid. But anyway, I'm going to turn it over to you and let you explain. You're a veteran from the Navy, and then you got involved down south of Atlanta in Andersonville. So I'm going to turn it over to you.
Well, hey, thanks, David. So, yes, I had a long career for 30 plus years with the National Park Service, which is, of course, the keeper of America's natural and cultural heritage. And during my career, I bounced all around, and I was a reservist, a Navy reservist. And my longest stretch, I guess you would say, at any one place was at Andersonville National Historic Site. And what I find is a lot of people, Americans, Georgians, don't understand or realize that Andersonville, yes, has this amazing Civil War story, which is incredible in and of itself. But it's much, much more, because when Congress passed the law in 1970, President Nixon signed it into law that created the National Historic Site there. It also put in the statute that this would be the memorial to all prisoners of war in American history. And so that is from the American Revolution until we decide not to have wars anymore. And so the historic site is, again, so much more than just this story of Camp Sumter, the official name of Andersonville Prison that was operated by the Confederacy for 14 months from early 1864 until the end of the war in 1865. It's also somewhat, I guess you would say, infamous story, because Andersonville is generally recognized as the worst prisoner of war camp in the Civil War. And I'm reluctant to say that, because a lot of times people will get upset. They'll say, well, the camps in the North were really bad too, where Confederates were held. And they were in fact terrible. And the death rates at Andersonville, as well as other camps, were way too high. They never needed to be that high. And so they were just terrible, terrible places. But as James McPherson, perhaps the most preeminent Civil War scholar today, says, Andersonville was in a class all by itself, and it was. It really was. Just some basics about the prison and what it was. And just some simple stuff. It was placed in southwest Georgia because they wanted to be away from the fighting. They needed rail access to get prisoners in and out and supplies in and out. And they wanted to be away from a population center. In other words, they wanted to be in an isolated rural area. And so they basically just found a spot and built a 16.5-acre pen. And the pen was with a fence of log walls, of logs put in the ground, so that the logs, they were roughly 22 feet long and 5 feet in the ground, so roughly 16, 17 feet tall. The original design was going to hold 6,000 prisoners. They later revised it up to 10,000. And by the time they figured out they needed to expand it, they were already at 25,000 prisoners.
I can't imagine the living conditions that would have.
Yes, and it's very, very hard for people today to kind of get a feeling for it as well. But anyway, so 16.5 acres, and so in June they decide to basically expand it out, and they go to one side and add another 10 acres on, so that makes it 26.5 acres. And so by the time mid-August comes around, the prison population is just shy of 33,000. Mm. So when you take the prisoners and you add in the guards, the Confederate guards that are there, which are a significant number, well over 1,000, In August of '64, Andersonville Prison is the fifth largest city in the Confederate States. It's pretty close to being fourth. So it is just an enormous place of people densely packed into this very tight space. And everything you can imagine that could go wrong went wrong. Whether it was food, sanitation, clothing, shelter, medical care, everything was it was a complete breakdown. And so much so that the Confederates recognize it, and they recognize that they're just failing miserably. Interestingly enough, we all know about inspector generals. The Confederate Army Inspector General sent a guy to go look into all of this, and he wrote a scathing report just saying, this is gross mismanagement. So even like I said, the Confederate government understood it. But it was a liberating raid from the North, which the Confederates were always afraid of, which actually scared them into getting prisoners out. And they started dispersing the prison population beginning in September. Now, the prison continued to operate all the way into April and May when it's liberated of 1865. But the numbers are significantly down. But again, it's just everything that could go wrong went wrong.
Fred, who was in charge of Andersonville during this time?
Yeah.
And
So
did he or she or whoever it was, I assume a he, was he there the whole time?
No. So, like so many things, it's complicated. The real person who you could probably put a finger on the most and say this is the person is in charge is a General John Winder. We all know about a town in Georgia named for Winder, but Winder's the guy in charge. He's a career Army officer, and he's a very, he's generally seen as a person who's relatively competent, but he's sort of beyond the age of being able to take up the rigors of battle, being on the battlefield, and so he kind of evolves into this job, first in Richmond, but then later in Georgia, and he's not just in charge of Andersonville; he's in charge of other prisons as well. But Andersonville's the big one, and but he had sort of, I guess you almost might say, the unfortunate luck of he died of a heart attack in the winter of 1865 when he was over in Millen, Georgia, inspecting one of the new camps that was being built for the overflow. It's called Camp Lawton. And so he probably would have been in big trouble had he survived to the end of the Civil War. But the guy who gets all the credit for the bad things at Andersonville is a fellow named Heinrich Wirtz, Captain Heinrich Wirtz. And he is there at Andersonville in May of 1865 when the camp is liberated, and he is taken to Washington, D.C., and in the late summer and fall of 1865, he is tried, convicted, and executed for war crimes.
Wow.
It is a enormous case. All of the newspapers are following it day by day by day, and it is it's a huge trial. It's a military commission. It's not a civil trial, and so, in fact, the person in charge of it is a guy who we've all heard about. His name was Union General Lew Wallace, who later went on to write the most popular novel in American history, Ben-Hur. And Lew Wallace presides over this trial. And the trial becomes sort of the pattern of what to do and what not to do later at the end of World War II in Nuremberg and in Japan, in Tokyo, when those war criminals were tried. And so that's why I often say that the implications of Andersonville and what happened go far beyond the Civil War. It literally, Civil War prisons and how to treat prisoners, and the kind of the lesson, the terrible lesson of Andersonville, has an enormous impact on world history.
Well, I guess. Fred, I need to stop you there, and we need to take our first break. And
Sure.
This is fascinating. You know, it's a shame we're not getting what we should in our history books, and I've stated that over and over again many, many times. And like you said, it's not just Georgia history or American history, it's world history at this point. But we'll be back with Fred in just a moment, right after a couple of messages.
Former four-time Super Bowl champion with the Pittsburgh Steelers and Vietnam veteran. As a board member, I'd like to talk to you about Warriors to Citizen, a nonprofit organization that helps American heroes, soldiers, police, fire, EMT, and their families recover from the psychological harm caused by career-induced stress. Over the last 20 years, broken relationships have been a major causal factor for the highest documented divorce rate and resulting suicides in this population. This program, From Warriors to Citizen, is delivered free to families by professionals, all whom served in uniform and understand the needs to be addressed. I ask for your support, so please go to our website, warriorstocitizen.org, and find out how you can help, either by making a donation or sharing this information with an American hero that you may know. And thank you.
If you live to serve and want to make an even bigger difference, consider joining the U.S. Army. With training in fields like medical care, linguistics, and engineering, an Army career can amplify your efforts with humanitarian opportunities all over the world. Plus, you'll receive competitive pay and incredible benefits, so you'll be taken care of, too. Learn more at GoArmy.com.
Hello, my name is Rick White, and I'm the director of the Georgia Military Veterans Hall of Fame. I want to encourage all Georgia veterans to consider being nominated to the Georgia Military Veterans Hall of Fame. And if you are a Georgia veteran, then the definition of a Georgia veteran is either you were born in the state of Georgia, or you've lived here 10 years, or you were raised your right hand and joined the military in this state. You are considered a Georgia veteran. For further information, go to www.gmvhof.org, or you can contact me at 678-427-0915. We'd love to have your nomination for the Georgia Military Veterans Hall of Fame. Thank you so much.
And want to remind everyone that you're listening to America's Web Radio, and we appreciate you listening. I want to add to what Rick was just saying about the Georgia Military Veterans Hall of Fame. They're going to be having their induction ceremony for the 2020 class April the 3rd. It'll start at 2 o'clock. It's going to be held in Johns Creek in Newtown Park, where the Healing Wall is. And if you haven't been to the Healing Wall, we certainly recommend that you go. It's the replica of the Vietnam Veterans Wall in Washington, D.C. And we learned yesterday in the same area, they're going to be putting a memorial in for the veterans of Desert Shield and Desert Storm. So we were delighted to hear that. That will be, they're hoping to have groundbreaking very shortly. But April the 3rd, mark it on your calendar. And as Rick White always says, bring your own box of Kleenex, as you'll hear some incredible stories. And Fred, I believe you said you were going to be there.
Absolutely.
And so we'll be able to get your 8x10 glossy and your signed 8x10 glossy. Is that right?
I don't think anybody wants that, but anyway. So.
Oh, you never know. You never know. Okay, so we're back in Andersonville, and I like I said as we were going to break, it's it's incredible that we don't know more about the history and the effects worldwide of what happened in Andersonville. So, if you don't mind, I'm going to turn it back to you and keep learning.
Yeah, one of the kind of interesting things that happens before Andersonville is opened is that President Lincoln and you don't hear this name a lot. Everybody knows about Grant and Sherman and all in the Union Army, but General Halleck, who is he's like the closest thing you might say to the chief of staff or the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff that we have today. So he's kind of Lincoln's, right under the Secretary of War, and he's his top armed or uniformed military person. And Halleck is very concerned about a number of issues, and talks to Lincoln about those things. And one of the first drivers is, what about guerrilla warfare? And that's mostly happening over in Missouri, Arkansas, Kansas. There's also a great concern about fugitive slaves and what happens when slaves are taken by the Union Army, and the Union Army, under kind of the sort of customs of war, you don't take property. And so the Union is looking at this as, wait a minute, this isn't property. These are human beings, and they need to be liberated. And then eventually, at the same time Lincoln and Halleck are having these discussions, Lincoln has already decided on the Emancipation Proclamation, and he's decided a big part of that is going to be raising Union regiments made up of black soldiers. And this the Confederacy was infuriated by the prospect of this because they saw this as a complete going after their system based on slavery. And so what Halleck and Lincoln do is they reach out to a professor. Hardly anybody's ever heard of this guy, but he's sort of getting a renewed look after a book that was just written a few years ago about him. And his name is Franz Lieber. He's a Prussian who's lived most of his life in the United States. He's in his 60s. He had actually lived for 20 years in Columbia, South Carolina, where he taught at South Carolina College, which later became the University of South Carolina. And Lieber is asked, now he's at Columbia University, he'd been there a year or two, and he's asked to write up the rules of war. What is right and what is wrong? And so he writes up this set of rules. He's got a committee of 4 Union generals to work with, and he does it over the course of about a month, around Christmas of 1862. And in the spring of 1863, that set of rules, 157 rules, called the Lieber Code, named for him, is issued as General Order Number 100, and it covers everything. And a big part of it is how prisoners of war would be treated. Things like you feed them. You feed them the same way you feed your own army. You take care of them medically. It also said you're not going to torture them. There were other things, like it said you're not allowed to rape women. Guerrilla tactics, or it says those are wrong and you shouldn't do those things because you need to be a uniformed military person, and if you're a spy, you can be hanged and killed. So anyway, there's the Lieber Code is in General Order number 100 is really the basis of the two Hague Conventions that are held. I think, I don't remember the year, but one of them was 1907, and they pretty much guide the world in World War I and World War II.
So
How about today? The Army just issued a new directive on the laws of war in 2016. So just 4 or 5 years ago, and it credits Lieber as the father of all of this.
Fred, how much of this is involved in the Geneva Convention?
Oh, it is. It's the basis of the Geneva Convention of 1949, which comes, at the end of World War II, where these rules are further refined, and they're refined because, things are different, things change, technology is different, and so it's Lieber and Halleck and Lincoln. They're the people who give all of this, get it all started.
Interesting.
So, anyway, it's just, it is. It's all fascinating history, and it's important. It gets a little bit geeky and wonky that you get into all of these details and all, and of course, whenever you're talking about Andersonville too, at times it's very uncomfortable just because you're talking about very, very unpleasant things. Things that you just don't want to talk about in polite society. One of the things is that what killed so many of these guys was that they were fed what's called unbolted cornmeal. They were fed other things, but that was the staple of what they received to eat every day. And what that is unbolted cornmeal is where the dried corn is ground up, cob and all, not just the kernels. And our bodies, our stomachs, our digestive systems can't digest the cob. It's literally like almost eating broken glass. And so it ripped their stomachs up. And so a lot of them suffered from amoebic dysentery, meaning you're bleeding as in your excrement.
Right.
And there were intestinal worms, intestinal parasites that were just, in those crowded conditions. And literally the men were walking in excrement all the time.
Fred, we're gonna have to let people think about that for a minute while we take another break. But I want to get, when we come back, I want to get more into what we're talking about. So we'll be back with Fred Boyles right after this.
Ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls of all ages, join me, Roger B., every Tuesday at 1400 hours right here on America's Web Radio for the Locked and Loaded Show. We will talk about guns, weapons, ammo, gun accessories, prepping, and so much more. So be sure to join us every Tuesday at 1400 or 2 p.m. for Locked and Loaded on America's Web Radio.
Hi, this is Rocky Blair, former 4-time Super Bowl champion with the Pittsburgh Steelers and Vietnam veteran. As a board member, I'd like to talk to you about Warriors to Citizen, a nonprofit organization that helps American heroes, soldiers, police, fire, EMT, and their families recover from the psychological harm caused by career-induced stress. Over the last 20 years, broken relationships have been a major causal factor for the highest documented divorce rate and resulting suicides in this population. This program, From Warriors to Citizen, is delivered free to families by professionals, all whom served in uniform and understand the needs to be addressed. I ask for your support, so please go to our website, warriorstocitizen.org, and find out how you can help, either by making a donation or sharing this information with an American hero that you may know. And thank you.
Whether cruising the strip in a 57 Chevy or or taking the family on a vacation in a 71 Oldsmobile Vista Cruiser, you need to tune in to Classic Cars with Steve Ronaldo and Jim Weber every Saturday from 8 to 9 a.m. on americaswebradio.com.
You're listening to America's Web Radio on the americasbroadcastnetwork.com. Thank you for listening.
And we're back on David's Pick, and our guest today is Fred Boyles, and we're talking about a very terrible time in our history, and that was our Civil War and our imprisonment in Andersonville of Union soldiers and the horrific conditions they lived in. Fred, to your knowledge in your studying, and it was bad enough just what you were talking about, what they were feeding the prisoners, and I can just imagine the intestinal problems. Your colon just can't handle what you were talking about, and like you said, it was like eating glass. But during the time that Andersonville was open, and you can't help but compare it to today and the COVID crisis. But was there ever any breakout of anything during the period of when they were open and imprisoning Union soldiers?
You mean in terms of diseases?
Right, like the Black Plague or this or that or whatever?
So by far it was just so many things. By far the most common and what really just the prisoners seemed to write about, and those who kept diaries, and complain about the most was scurvy. And that's
No
just
fruit.
from not, and they knew at the time, the importance of vitamin C and fresh produce, vegetables and fruits, and how important they were. But scurvy was probably the most prolific, and scurvy is not only, it's a long, slow process, it's also incredibly painful and difficult, and it just affects your body. But smallpox got started within the prison. They were all terribly afraid of that. But many other diseases as well were rampant. And they would, one thing I did not mention is, you at its peak, you have 33,000 prisoners in August of '64, but over the course of the prison's history, there are roughly 45,000 that go through Andersonville in one form or another. And of that number, 12,920 die. And all of them are buried in the National Cemetery that is there at Andersonville National Historic Site, which is part of the National Cemetery System, some over 150 national cemeteries that are across our country that, are solemn and very, very special places. Anyway, that's roughly 29% of the prisoners at Andersonville who die. One of the historians that probably wrote the best book on Andersonville, a guy named William Marvel, he says that number's probably closer to 35%, because what it doesn't take into account are those people who suffered greatly at Andersonville, but during that time when they were moving them out, they might have died a day, a few days, 2 or 3 days, a week later, and but they weren't at Andersonville when they died. But they died due to the conditions that they received while being prisoners at Camp Sumter, Andersonville. So there were just all kinds of things that affected them and from those conditions. But without a doubt, the worst thing is just the filth of it all. There was really no plan. Well, I take that back. There was a plan for how to get the sewage out of the prison. It was through the creek that was to bring water into the prison. So it was located at that spot because there was this nice little creek that flowed right through the middle. And so the creek where it came in would provide clean drinking water where it came into the prison, and then where it went out they put in sinks. Sinks is a Civil War term for latrine, and basically the prisoners would go to that spot to go to the bathroom. And the problem was that a lot of them never made it there. They suffered from diarrhea and dysentery, and so that quickly broke down, as well as the Confederate guard camp was upstream from the prison. So the Confederate guards were throwing stuff into the creek, and so there were problems with the water that came in, and even though they had a plan, it just never really was properly implemented.
You know, in many of our shows, we've talked to Vietnam veterans, we've talked to Desert Shield, Desert Storm veterans, and even a couple of Korean veterans. And, you know, we've talked about particularly Vietnam and so many coming back with PTSD and so forth and so on, and that, you know, not only was it the conditions, but the realization of how one man could treat another man, and some of the atrocities that the North Vietnamese did, not only in prison camps, but also just in the field, in the field of battle. But then you look at something like Andersonville, and you wonder, how, you know, this was American on American. And yeah, I know the North and the South, and yeah, the Union and the Confederacy and all of this, but still, it's one human to another human, the bottom line, and you wonder what both sides were thinking, you know, and particularly the Confederate side. You know, was there any? Well, let me ask: was there any religion in the camp? And at the same token, were there any Confederates that tried to help in any way?
Yes, oh, absolutely, and certainly, faith plays an enormous role in what happens, and there's a sort of a recurring theme of the whole thing of that when you're in a really bad situation, you kind of turn to back to your roots and your, you know, the kind of the ethics and the core of what make us all a human being, and generally that's taught to us by our parents and the people we look up to. And so for many of them, many of the prisoners, it was their faith. There's one prisoner's diary that's one of my favorites. It was by a fellow named Frederick Augustus James, and he was from Massachusetts, and he was a sailor in the Navy, and he had great faith and wrote about it in his diary regularly, about how he, you know, how important it was of his faith, and they would have services in small ways within the camp, but they would also, and I remember James writes this a lot of times, you know, he would know that on that particular day it was a Sunday, and how he missed going to church, and he missed his those people of his faith that he could be with, and he longed for that very much. So you do read that a lot in the accounts. So yeah, their faith was very important to them.
What were the guards like? And you know, I realize that you weren't there and you can't describe, but were they just
Sure.
torturous, or were they?
No. They well, first off, there's sort of a basic here, and that is that guard duty at this place, or at any prison, is not the best duty. And sometimes you might say the best soldiers don't end up as guards. And in the beginning, there are 4 or 5 regular units from Georgia and Alabama. There's an artillery unit from Florida. Cannons are a big deal. And so those units are there guarding, but all the time the Confederate authorities are saying, we got to get these guys out of here because we need them on the front lines. And so there is a move to bring in what are called the Georgia Reserves. And these are the folks who are not in regular units, but in rather these nothing like the National Guard or the reserves of today, but literally, people they could grab and within the state and get them to serve. And interestingly enough, a guy named General Howell Cobb, who was quite prominent in national politics as well as Georgia politics, he is a general at the time. So he had been a congressman and cabinet officer before the war in the United States government. And but he's the one who's got to get up the reserves to replace those regular units. And his nemesis, his political enemy, so to speak, is the governor of Georgia, Joe Brown. And so these two guys are kind of locking horns over who can serve in the Georgia Reserves and who can be exempt. Because you got a lot of people who are like, do I want to go and fight up at, Chickamauga or, Gettysburg or something like this? I mean, they're all, and they're, and so the governor had said if you were, if you had an official position in your county government, you were exempt from serving in the Georgia Reserves. And so everybody, was, the assistant clerk of the court and, getting these jobs that so that they could be exempt from service. But in the end, they got up enough and they sent these units back, and the Georgia Reserves, for most of the time that Andersonville is open, are the principal guards. And these tended to be teenage boys and, I won't say old men, but men in their 40s and 50s. And again, they're not the best soldiers just because of their age, lack of experience, and their being along in years. They have some pretty crappy weapons. They don't have the best weapons. Many of them have what are called smooth-bore flintlock weapons that are like from years and years before. And the job is terrible. If nothing else, just the stench is just enough to, just drive you crazy.
Fred, I need to stop you there and take our last break, and we'll come back and talk more about the Guards right after this.
Okay.
Hello. My name is Colonel Retired Rick White, a United States Army veteran, and I'm the director of the Georgia Military Veterans Hall of Fame. I would like to encourage all Georgia veterans to consider being nominated to the Georgia Military Veterans Hall of Fame. If you are a Georgia veteran, and the Georgia veteran's definition is you are either born in this state, or you lived in the state 10 years, or you raised your right hand and joined the military in the state of Georgia, you are considered a Georgia veteran. For further information, go to your website at www.gmvhof.org, or you can contact me at 678-427-0915. Nominations need to be in by the last Friday in August each year. Again, if you're a Georgia veteran, or you're a friend or family member of a Georgia veteran, living or deceased, please consider nominating that veteran to this highly noble and rare Hall of Fame for our great state. Thank you so much.
Hi, this is Steve Ronaldo, host of the Classic Car Show on America's Web Radio. Just talking to you about antique car insurance. I think that if you're looking for the best coverage for your classic car, consider J.C. Taylor Insurance. They've been my insurer for years in this hobby and have the top rating of all of the insurance companies in the hobby. When you get ready for insurance, call J.C. Taylor or visit jctaylor.com on the Internet.
Ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls of all ages, join me, Roger B., every Tuesday at 1400 hours right here on America's Web Radio for the Locked and Loaded Show. We will talk about guns, weapons, ammo, gun accessories, prepping, and so much more. So be sure to join us every Tuesday at 1400 or 2 p.m. for Locked and Loaded on America's Web Radio.
You're listening to America's Web Radio on the AmericasBroadcastNetwork.com. Thank you for listening.
And we're back on David's Pick with our guest, Fred Boyles. And Fred's been talking about Andersonville during the Civil War and the Guards. And we only have about 15 minutes, so let's start updating it a little bit, if you don't mind, Fred.
Sure. So, I've already mentioned about the war crimes trial of Henry Wirtz that takes place afterwards. And it's also interesting that it's just after the war, in the summer of 1865, when and I should back up and say one of the things that they really did right at Andersonville is certainly highlighted so many of the terrible things about the place, is that they really kept a good, accurate ledger of the people who died to make sure that their loved ones would know. And there was so much during the Civil War of families just not knowing. And out of the 12,920 that died at Andersonville, it's a little over, it's about 460, I believe, is the number that are unknowns. So it's a very small percentage. So they were carefully identified and were meticulously buried. And so there was a list of the dead, which was kept by one of the prisoners, a fellow named Dorrance Atwater. And after the war, he was able to get the list of the dead out and of the camp, and he appealed to kind of the person in the day who was sort of the most famous humanitarian of that time, a woman named Clara Barton, who we all know, the founder of the American Red Cross. And she appeals to Edwin Stanton, the Secretary of War, and they make a trip to Georgia, and they establish the National Cemetery there at Andersonville. And right before she leaves with Atwater and a small Army contingent, she literally raises the first American flag to fly over the National Cemetery at Andersonville, the flag that still flies there, of course, today. And it is that National Cemetery which is the beginning of the preservation effort of Andersonville. Later, the prisoners themselves, the men who survived, were able to, through their organizations, they had their own groups in the day. We have the Legion and the VFW. Well, the big group then was called the GAR, the Grand Army of the Republic, which was a organization of Union war veterans. And they were able to, working with another group, the WRC, the Women's Relief Corps, which was sort of the women's support of these kind of causes, veterans' causes. And they are able to purchase land where the prison site was. So the two areas are separated by a short distance. And so that land is preserved. And it's not until, I can't remember the year, but it's actually turned over to the Army. So the Army operates the National Cemetery and the prison site all the way until 1970, when that law is passed by the Congress to create the National Historic Site, as well as the memorial to all POWs in American history. It's mainly led by a group of local kind of community leaders, one of which you might have heard of. He was, at the time, he was the state senator. His name was Jimmy Carter, and he and others were part of that effort to get the site made a National Historic Site as a part of the National Park system. And the Army was happy about that. The Army had operated the site for many years, and that's not the Army's job, so to speak. The Army's job is to do other things and not to operate historic sites. And so it wasn't for the first, say, 10 or 15 years that the Park Service was operating Andersonville. They were mainly just trying to get organized and get the whole thing put together, and mainly concentrating on the Civil War story. And it was one of the rangers at the park that realized, hey, we're not dealing with this larger story, all POWs in American history. And so they put together a small museum that was, and I mean small, it was not very big at all, that opened in the late 80s. But that kind of sparked the effort to build a museum to honor all POWs in American history right there in Andersonville, Georgia. And that dream came true on April the 9th, 1998, when the National POW Museum opened. That event was attended by roughly 4,000 people. It was carried live on several networks, TV networks. Senator John McCain was the principal speaker of that event. And it was, for many, many former POWs, this was a very important, it was like a dream come true that their story would not be forgotten, and that it would be
So if I came down, Fred, what would I see in the museum? How is it? How are the individual POWs recognized, or
Yes. So it's a little bit unconventional, but I think it works very well because the museum is organized based on the experiences that are common to all POWs. So in other words, you're not going to go in there and there's a room on the American Revolution and then there's a room on the War of 1812. No, there's because every POW gets captured. So the capture experience is presented. And whether you're captured on the field of battle in 1778, or you're captured in Vietnam because your jet gets shot down, even though the technology is different, the capture experience is basically the same. And so the exhibits that are presented at the museum are capture, journey to camp, living conditions, communications, those left behind, the story of the families who are wondering and not knowing what's going on. Privation, that's where we deal with extraction of information, solitary confinement, torture, those kind of things. Morale and relationships, and escape, a story everybody's interested in, but is a very small part of the story. And then finally, liberation and going home, which is sort of the uplifting and the inspiring. That's the one you already talked about, having a box of Kleenex. That's the one that always affects me when I see those pictures and hear the stories of people being reunited with their families.
Just like you said, that's a strange sort of. My first thing would have been either wars or dates, but having it that way, the capture and so, that's who came up with that idea.
Well, it was one of our park rangers, and it was actually probably wouldn't have happened had it not been for we were able to contract with a company that was one of the best exhibit design firms in the country out of California, and they latched onto it and took the germ of the idea there, and then took it beyond. The other piece to this too, and a new exhibit that was added I guess about 10 years ago, and that was called "What is a POW?" And that, I know that sounds kind of like, what do you mean? Everybody knows what a POW is. Well, no, that's where you get into all of the kind of the unusual parts of it, and that's where Franz Lieber comes in, the Lieber Code, civilian detainees, and the North Vietnamese. When our POWs would say, well, wait a minute, the Geneva Convention, and they'd say, well,
we're not part of it.
You've never declared war on us, so you're not POWs. You're not covered under the Geneva Convention. So you get into all of these kind of, sort of scenarios that are cause you to scratch your head and wonder, because and by the way, this stuff is it's still relevant today. It's still very relevant today. Just last week, the Army issued a decision regarding one of the folks from Afghanistan, and even though that individual, he had been, according to the Army, he had committed murder, and so the Army, but he was pardoned by President Trump, but the Army just last week decided that they were going to withhold his medals and his, I can't remember the exact.
Do you have a Purple Heart or anything like that?
Well, yeah, all of his medals.
Okay.
His, I'm sorry, I'm having a blank here, but it was his. He was a Special Forces designation, warfare designation. I'm probably saying that wrong, but anyway, he was an Army major, is an Army major, and he's retired now. But so, in other words, again, this stuff is still relevant. It is still taught today to whether it's to soldiers.
Fred, I'm going to have to ask you if you'll come back, and we'll continue this because we're running out of time. And what you're saying is terribly important. And as a veteran, you are our history book today, and we have to keep getting this word out. So with that being said, Fred, thank you for coming back, and will you come back again?
Oh, sure, I will. And again, thank you for having me and allowing us to share this often unknown story to a larger audience.
Well, we're going to keep telling that story. And stay tuned for Ron Bachman, and he'll be with us in just a few minutes. Again, thank you, Fred.
You're listening to America's Web Radio.
That was great, Fred.
Okay, good.
Yeah, I enjoyed, this is one